Buenos días. Seguimos avanzando aquí en Madrid Plataforma en la jornada, en este lugar que, como saben, está siendo encuentro durante los últimos 3 días de 500 empresas, de más de 1.500 reuniones, 300 expertos, 3.000 asistentes, también los que nos están escuchando por streaming en todas las partes del mundo y también en redes sociales. Un espacio que, como saben, intenta acercar, crear oportunidades y impulsar a los negocios y a las empresas a estar más cerca entre un lado y el otro del Atlántico. Un tiempo para encontrar uniones en un momento de distanciamiento social. Hoy vamos a hablar esta mañana precisamente de ello, de crear oportunidades en América Latina, y para ello me gustaría presentarles a doña María Paz Ramos Resa. Ella es directora general internacional de inversiones del Ministerio de Industria, Comercio y Turismo, y va a ser la encargada de moderar la siguiente mesa y presentarnos a los asistentes. Muchas gracias y bienvenida.
Gracias a ti, gracias a todos y a todos los asistentes por streaming. Voy a empezar primero a presentar este plantel de altísima calidad que nos acompaña hoy. Ricardo Santamaría Burgos, director de Riesgo País y Gestión de Deuda en CESEN, la compañía española de seguro de crédito a la exportación. Jesús Dangaray López, director de filiales de CESE, que nos va a hablar de cómo hacer negocio en Latinoamérica. Juan Francisco Martínez, director general de Política Comercial del Ministerio de Industria, Comercio y Turismo y especialista en los acuerdos de la Unión Europea con todos los países del mundo. Y finalmente Javier Serra, director general de internacionalización de la empresa de ICES, del Instituto España Exportaciones e Inversiones, y nos va a proporcionar información muy útil sobre los instrumentos de los que dispone ICES para apoyar la internacionalización de las empresas españolas. No, a nadie se le escapa el interés tradicional de las empresas españolas por América Latina como destino de exportación e inversión. En casi todas las grandes y no tan grandes, medianas, incluso pequeñas empresas, dentro de sus estrategias de internacionalización a medio y largo plazo está el continente latinoamericano, el subcontinente latinoamericano, como un objetivo esencial de esta estrategia. Están presentes en ramas clave como las infraestructuras, la energía, el sector financiero, la ingeniería especializada o plástica. Y todas las empresas españolas en América Latina han contribuido significativamente a la modernización de estos países, a la creación de riqueza y empleo y, en última instancia, a la reducción de la pobreza en muchos de esos países. Para dar sencillamente un marco contextual, la totalidad del comercio español con América Latina asciende a 31.000 millones de euros anuales. En 2019, me parece que 2020 no es un año de referencia para dar un orden de magnitudes de nuestras relaciones con América Latina, y lo que representa tanto de forma muy equivalente en términos de exportaciones como de exportaciones, equivale a un 5% del comercio exterior español con el resto del mundo, siendo las exportaciones un poco menor, 15.000 millones en 2019 y 17.000 las importaciones. La pauta de intercambios con América Latina, sin embargo, sigue una pauta extremadamente tradicional del comercio de un país de la Unión Europea con potencias emergentes y países en desarrollo, de tal forma que la suma de nuestra exportación de bienes de equipos en manufacturas de consumo y automoción equivale a un 82% del total de nuestras exportaciones, que son, por lo tanto, exportaciones fundamentalmente industriales y de servicios y de suministros para la industria. Las importaciones, sin embargo, se puede decir que un 83% de nuestras compras a países de América Latina lo constituyen alimentos, productos energéticos y materiales primas, lo cual creo que es una cuestión a plantear, si estas pautas de Are these ways of conducting business sustainable in the long term, or are they going to change in the near future? If trade with Latin America is important, well, more so are the investment flows with Latin America. Latin America takes up 150 billion euros in the form of investments, Spanish investments. This is 32% of our total investment to the world, so exactly right after the EU, which takes up 39%. Mexico, Brazil and Chile are the main recipients of our investments and are the main recipients of Spanish companies. All big Spanish companies that have this impact on SMEs who are suppliers or subcontractors or engineering companies are present there.
Han estado hasta la fecha
presentes
en América Latina, que también es un inversor importante en España y que supone el 9,3% de la inversión total de países terceros en España. Por lo tanto, una relación importante, intensa, en crecimiento y donde las inversiones suponen una parte importantísima de nuestras relaciones económicas bilaterales. Por lo tanto, nuestra capacidad de la evaluación del riesgo
So our capacity to assess the risk in Latin America is quite strong. So this process is something we will deal with. There has been a reverse process, a disinvestment process. Spanish companies that are selling businesses in Latin America. So maybe we should. I think I shouldn't move my head too much because of this secondary effects. So we should look at the causes and the prospects of this inverse project. Naturgy, Banco Santander, and the other Spanish companies have decided to disinvest in some Latin American economies.
La crisis del COVID,
the COVID pandemic has, of course, impacted Latin American economies. It has worsened financial and funding problems. It has worsened also social problems in the region. So one of my questions to today's speakers is, what are the ideas regarding the recovery of the economy and social aspects? The
7,4% del PIB en 2020
considers that the region could grow by 4% this year and by almost 3% in 2022. These are estimates from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, but at the same time we should look at how this phenomenon affects our companies and to what extent our mechanisms, both information and risk coverage mechanisms, are they really, can they really face up to this recovery challenge in Latin America? Then I think that we will also look at the challenges, at the responses that can be given, so the responses to the challenges that have arisen from the pandemic, and we are going to talk about the opportunities and about the economic and political context in this region of the world, where there are now electoral processes in the form of important countries of this region. Now, last but not least, I would like to say that the fact that our companies have been there in Latin America, and also the mechanisms that we can create in order to support our companies there, well, they are closely linked to our capacity, our ability to detect and to improve, to contribute to improve the business environment in many Latin American economies. I think that many companies and also our public administrations should take the necessary steps to boost in an efficient manner the social responsibility aspect of companies, which is part of good governance and of transparency and of the protection of the environment, puede facilitar
and
la
of
implantación
social
de nuestras
protection. This can help
empresas,
our
su
companies
permanencia y la ampliación de
stay
sus
there
negocios en el
and be
continente y
more
ayudar
present. And this
quizás
could
a
also help
mejorar
our
el
companies
clima de
contribute to
negocios
improve
en
the
un círculo
business
virtuoso.
environment.
Y sin extenderme
there.
más, vamos
Without
a
further
empezar.
ado, I
Voy a
would
empezar
now like to give the floor to
preguntar
our
a
speakers. I
Ricardo
would like to ask
Santamaría
Santamaría
cuál es su evaluación de la situación
what
política y
is his
económica
assessment of the
actual
economic and political
en el continente
situation in
latinoamericano
the
y
Latin
cómo
American
esta situación
continent,
afecta
and how
actualmente a
does
las
this
empresas,
situation
puesto que la segunda parte la
impact
dedicaré
companies?
más a las
The second
perspectivas.
part will be devoted to
Directamente no me voy a
prospects,
mover.
to
Ricardo,
the future.
adelante.
I'm not going to move anymore. Ricardo, please, you have the floor.
Como muy bien has dicho,
As you have very
Latinoamérica
rightly
es
said,
de
Latin
una
America
importancia trascendental
has
para la
a
economía española.
very significant importance for our economy.
Fundamentalmente como
It is important
destino
because it
de
is the
exportación,
destination of our
aunque no
exports.
debemos olvidar que de la exportación de bienes y servicios
The
a
exports of
Latinoamérica
goods and services to Latin
apenas
America
supone un
amounts to
5% del total de
5% only
exportaciones
of
de
the
bienes,
total amount
y
of
que además esta
exports of
cifra,
goods. And this
disminuyó
figure
ligeramente el pasado año.
rose
Hasta un
slightly
4%. Luego es un mercado
went
tremendamente
down to
importante para
4%
nuestras
last
empresas,
year.
y desde ese
So
punto de
Latin
vista
America
está
is a very
justificado que
important
tenga
market for us.
un interés
So it is
especial para
justified
nosotros. Pero es mucho
to
más
say that Latin
importante,
America is very
no
important
tanto
for us
como
and for our
destino de
investments.
exportación como
But it's
de presencia
not
en
only
nuestras
a target
en el
country
mundo,
for our
toda
investments,
la
but it is
importancia
an
que
important
tienen las
geographical
inversiones.
place
Aquellas
for
primeras
our
inversiones que
companies.
se realizaron en
The
los
first
años
investments
80
made
y
in the
90,
80s and in the
la que se denominó la
90s,
primera ola,
which were called the
donde
first wave
gran
of
parte de nuestro
investments,
IBEX
well, were
migró
important
y
because
creó
a
importantes
large part
filiales
of
en
our
el
IBEX
continente, y que
went
explican
out
por qué
there
hoy
to that
24%
continent,
de
and
los ingresos del IBEX
24%
están
of
generados
the
en
revenues of our IBEX, or Spanish stock market, are created there in Latin America. Precisely, some of these companies have huge exposition. For instance, Telefónica, there are two main banks, BBVA and Banco Santander. They invoice more than 45% of their total amount of revenues there in Latin America, focusing in countries such as in Mexico for BBVA or Banco Santander in Brazil. And the same is true for Telefónica, but there are many other companies significantly represented in the energy sector, for instance. Repsol or Iberdrola, for instance, are good examples, with a turnover of 25% of the total turnover from there. And then there is CESCE, which also, of course, has an important presence there, but also Mafre, another insurance company whose turnover is 30%. So 30% of its revenues come from Latin America, or the Group Medial. Also 30% of its revenues rise there in Latin America, and they very much focus in Mexico regionally or geographically. Now, what happens in Latin America really affects Spain. 20% of their GDP is deposited as investments in Latin America. So 20% of our GDP, as you rightly said, the flow of investments has significantly gone down over the last 5 years, by 50% even. I must say that Spanish companies are not an exception in this environment, in this phenomenon. The fact that the investments have gone down, direct investments have gone down, is a big problem, and that accounts for a great part of the economic drift of Latin America over the last years. Since the last international economic crisis, where especially countries with financial needs or funding needs suffered, and so countries that needed to turn to third countries for funding, well, since that crisis, all these economies have suffered especially badly. That is really the case of Latin America. The impact was that most countries went into a recession at that time, and many of these countries had to seek help from raw materials, or from oil in some cases. So this could help them recover to some extent in the following years. Now, Latin America's problem really is that in 2014, the raw material crisis broke out, and that crisis meant a significant fall of oil prices and of main commodities. Let's not forget that there are countries such as Venezuela whose export revenues depend to 80% on oil. Colombia and Ecuador, the exports based on petroleum, on oil, amount to 30%, and economies such as the Mexican one, while the oil is 8% of their GDP, or Brazil. In Brazil, it amounts to 12%. So if you think of Chile, 50% of their exports come from copper, on the other hand, and Bolivia, 26% comes from gas, the gas sector, or gas raw material. And this is true for many other Andean Latin American countries. So the fall of commodities hit hard these countries. Brazil and Mexico, well, for them, their GDP is more than 50% of Latin America's GDP. And they had a terrible crisis, which turned into a recession that lasted several years. Well, over all these years, this foreign direct investment started drawing back from Latin America as a consequence of the economic consequences and of a decrease in trust.
And this withdrawal of growing investment aggravated the main problem affecting the whole economic model of Latin America, namely a model lacking investment. Investment figures in Latin America are widely below the world average, let alone emerging countries. Even though we're talking about emerging countries, their possibilities of investment in GDP terms are way below the figures of emerging Asian countries, for example, which are showing figures much higher than world figures. You mean both internally, domestic and foreign investment, right? Yes, because in cases of uncertainty, capital just flees from those economies, aggravating the situation. But that lack of investment and funding added to a rate of informality, which is horrifying, because informal economy in Latin America, on average, is above 50%, and that all amounts to very low productivity rates. Evidently, the economic and dynamic model needs high productivity based on high levels of investment, and that makes the model outdated in Latin America. It's obsolete. And from that point on, Latin America lags behind in terms of growth as compared to the world economy. And in that situation, the COVID-19 pandemic aggravated things, and that's why Latin American developments in that respect have been worse than in the rest of the country. In 2020, it was fall in GDP in Latin America, which was bigger than 7%, double the world rate, and 3 times the rates or the figure for emerging economies. We need to include China there, and we know that China even showed positive growth last year. But those were development for the whole region, for Latin America. And that is also due to the influence of the pandemic, of course. The first wave of the pandemic went a little bit more unnoticed in Latin America than in Europe or in the United States. there was some delay, but it's true that some countries like Peru were deeply affected. But it's true that denial was also a problem in many of the Latin American countries. We still remember Bolsonaro's words saying that it was just a little flu, or Mexico with Mr. López Obrador, yes, showing the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe as the solution, or saying that the Mexican race was particularly prepared to fight against COVID, and that delayed the adoption of strict measures against the COVID pandemic. The best example of measures are to be found in Asia. It's true that Western countries have not done so well, but in Latin America things were worse, and that's why subsequent waves of the pandemic are even worse in Latin America. We are all aware of the havoc of the pandemic in Mexico and Brazil, with very bad posts in the ranking. We need to add to that the dengue epidemic in Latin America from 2019 to 2020. It wreaked havoc, and several million people were deeply affected, and the healthcare systems of Latin America were subjected to special pressure. And as I said before, there's a huge rate of informality in Latin America. In that case, it is very hard to adopt restrictive measures against COVID pandemic. And on top of that, we've got a high percentage of unprotected population in terms of disease, unemployment, and all of that aggravates the situation of the economy. And 99% of the Latin America economy consists of small businesses, and they are the ones suffering the most. And then they face liquidity problems and have no reserves to cater for bad times. There are additional circumstances affecting very negatively Latin America as well. Latin America depends on tourism, for example. Spain understands very well how detrimental it is to have such a high percentage of tourism in pandemic times, when there are reductions of tourism by 75%. In the case of Latin America, that figure was 60 or 65% in most of the countries. And there are countries with very important tourism sector, for example, Mexico, more than 10%. Same applies to Paraguay, Uruguay, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and others. A second question where the situation was not so negative, we were thinking about a severe contagion of the situation, had to do with remittances. We know that there are many Latin American workers in the United States. Actually, 65% of foreign population workers in the United States come from Mexico, and initially we thought that that would affect remittances in the United States that are quite important compensating factors for imbalances in Latin America. The situation was not so dire in that respect, fortunately, because those workers, those Latin American workers, work in essential sectors in the United States, so they were the least affected. But there's a very important factor, a foreign factor, to be taken into account, namely dependence on foreign raw materials. For example, the price fall of crude oil was very important. Negative figures were reached up to $41 per barrel as the maximum in the year, which was quite lower than previous prices before the pandemic. And that affected very deeply countries such as Venezuela, Ecuador, Mexico, etc. There's another important factor to be considered, and that's how focused certain economies are on certain exportations to certain countries, to China and to others. Let's not forget that China was initially very affected by the pandemic due to very strict measures against the pandemic, and that distorted stock chains. And that affected countries around the Andes, Chile, Peru. Yeah, the collapse of where transport of goods transports, excuse me. Yes, and that affected the price of commodities as well. And then the Mexican economy itself is very dependent on the United States. 74% of exports, of Latin American exports, go to the United States. 44% of the imports received by Mexico come from the United States, and that is due to the industrial Mexican model based on the automobile industry. NAFTA and TEMEC regimes have a lot to do with that. And the first wave impacting the United States also affected dramatically the Mexican economy. And that's why the Latin American economy has suffered the pandemic because of that, and that has also affected Spanish interests in the region. So, talking about the business environment, the business climate, let's say, we've mentioned these investments. Carlos said that the market doesn't attract investment, but rather disinvestment in the case of foreign investors. Jesus, you're quite aware of the situation of our companies in Latin America. You've got several subsidiaries there. What was the impact of the deterioration of the business environment on the liquidity profile and solvency profile of our clients, Spanish companies in the region? And what was the impact of the pandemic itself as well? Thank you very much, Maripaz. Yes, you're right. Ricardo was right. The pandemic is another factor to be added to the situation of the region, and it is not an easy situation. It is not easy to carry out the internationalization of Spanish companies in Latin America. That was a traditional presence, but there was always uncertainty with fragile economies, economies dependent on currency rates, currency exchange rates, developments affecting raw materials, legal uncertainty, tax and economic uncertainties and difficulties. So when Spanish companies decide to go to Latin America, they are aware that they are facing a process which is not free from risks and uncertainties. As Ricardo said, Spanish companies had a chance to develop their business in the main countries of the region. I think that during the financial crisis since 2017, internationalized Spanish companies were the ones that fared better in crisis situations, and that allowed them to have growth and an opportunity to focus on that region with their resources. So the region was coming out of a recession period with growths of 2 and 3% that were lower and lower. Maybe we had forgotten the problems of a healthcare crisis, but we did have other problems. For example, in Chile, there were social unrest, and that expanded to other countries such as Peru and neighboring countries. So that climate, that environment was adequately faced by Spanish companies. There were support mechanisms also for them on the part of the Spanish government. The pandemic has aggravated that situation. It has created even more inequality within and between countries in the region. But it is interesting to note that according to our experience and the experience of companies exporting to the region in 2020, throughout this pandemic period, failure to pay has not been growing. The situation was similar to the one in Europe, even though countries were spending less than emerging countries. I think we can say it was 8% expense in Brazil and others, but these countries did invest in support to companies, so the business environment was not worse because of that. Activity was working, but there were no defaults or problems of solvency, at least not as many as expected. It is true that in the future there might be defaults and a shutdown of companies. We're talking about very small companies, and those companies are not the clients of our exporters. So those agents that are free from that situation will be able to fare well. Another point that gives us some hints on the developments in the region is how the infrastructure projects have fared. The health crisis has stopped these projects, and those that were about to be started could not start. Spanish companies in that situation of blocked activities depend a lot on how governments acted, on whether they offered subsidies or facilitated things to carry on with the projects. These factors might have affected Spanish companies. However, in other countries, such as in Peru, the state, the government have helped companies by means of new rules so that more time was given to carry out the projects, and money was also anticipated for some companies so that they would not have problems of liquidity. So the impact was not very deep for Spanish companies, even though they could not do business as they had expected, but not that they lost contracts or solvency. Prospects along these lines are quite positive, but prospects will be a matter of our final talk. But you can say something on respect to that. Yes, I think prospects are quite positive because one of the leverages of governments are infrastructure, and public expenditure can be targeting infrastructure because the region really needs them. Thank you very much. So now we're going to deal with more tangible topics. I'd like to ask Javier about his experience in ISEX. What are our main competitors right now in Latin America? Which sectors for exports have greater potential in the region? What is your perception through your contacts, your daily contact with those companies that are operating in the 4 or 5 continents? What are their concerns and their sectoral focus?
Thank you. Well, as the other speakers, as Ricardo and Jesus have said, it is true that there has been a reverse effect or phenomenon of investments, especially from the pioneer companies, and there have been they were very well, they were businesses that worked in very well regulated contexts, but SMEs have been going from Spain throughout time. We have almost 7,000 companies there operating there, not only IBEX certified, there may be that is going down, but other new companies are going there from into sectors different from the regulated ones, so less exposed to the uncertainty that has just been talked about. The 7,000 companies that are in Spain, in Latin America, well, to those we have to add exporters. The raw data per year is maybe not that significant, but if we think of those exporters who are continually present in Latin America, well, maybe the number amounts to, in 2019, it was 14,000 regular companies exporting to Latin America. But besides the drop of exports, 17,000 regular exporters in 2020. So there has been a rise of these actors exporting. This shows that Spanish companies that bet for Latin American markets and who had already built some kind of presence there have been able to stay there, to maintain their presence there with a low turnover, but nevertheless, those who export every now and then only, well, those are the ones that have fallen most significantly, or mainly they have dropped out. Now, looking at a sectoral analysis, I would like to say that, okay, there is the grey economy, and there is the drop of the price of commodities, and the drop of turn of revenues, and the pandemic, and the consumption of the purchase of products has gone down. Some of them has gone down. For instance, fashion or cosmetics have gone down, but because those are very closely linked to social life. Also, automotive purchases have gone down, and more household products have been bought. And also, so companies have stopped investing in capital, so companies have decided to postpone their investment decisions, and that's why they have not invested in capital goods, especially in those sectors where prices have plummeted. So all of this has impacted our exports. You have also talked about the big hotel chains. And, well, of course, that has gone down to zero totally, that sector. And now, the future, what does it look like? Well, for instance, the timing of recovery, that will have its impact sooner or later. Investment decisions will have to be resumed, but we do not know when companies will resume these processes. That is a big question mark. This will also depend on the recovery of China and also on the recovery of the US. Both of these processes are happening already. These are main clients for Latin America. And copper or soybean, for instance, are very important commodities for China and for the US. Now, the fiscal margin will continue to be low. It was low before the pandemic because of the history, of the recent history of this region. But, you know, those stimulus packages, which are smaller now, but nevertheless these go to very stressed out economies, so this will lead to even a lower fiscal margin, so that will hamper recovery. Now, infrastructure as a lever for recovery could be important. Now, Latin America is the region in the world with the highest index of urbanization. It was so before the pandemic, and it will continue to be so in the pandemic. There will be no migration from the cities to rural areas, as in some countries. And, well, the opportunity sectors will be profiled in the near future. Now, the international actors are key there in this region. As Ricardo said, they bring investment, and the capital that comes to this region comes mainly from international companies, so this is very important too. During the pandemic, priorities were health, the health sector, and maintaining the income, maybe in the recovery process or phase. Infrastructure will be the priority. Well, we'll have to look at this closely in the near future. Now, as exports recover because of external demand, I think that the will to increase added value to those exports will come back, so that they will be able to attract a bigger part of the value of these products that are being exported to China and to US. This is good news, isn't it? From ISEX, from the Spanish Institute for Foreign Trade, isn't it? At some point, the investment indexes will be recovered. We will only have to define in what sectors and in what regions of these countries the recovery will happen first, so that we can focus our trade on those regions. As I said, capital goods will recover also at some point. I don't know when, maybe in 2022 or 2023, but at some point companies will need to update the production equipment, the industry or mining, the mining sector. These are absolutely key sectors for this region. Or oil and gas too. Well, the health sector too is amongst the priority for international institutions, and these countries have very vulnerable health systems that has been that has been obvious during this crisis. And of course this creates opportunities for us, for instance, because we have pharma companies, we have medical device companies, we have medical technology companies that could really have good opportunities there. Now, I think that in the short term, priority will be in infrastructure and labor. And Spanish companies are not necessarily very competitive in these sectors, and also maintaining revenues. But what about China? Well, I would like to talk about China now in a moment. Okay, these are capital workforce intensive countries, of course, but this is maybe not where we can compete. Now, transport and urban services, that has been very covered too, as well as cleaning water and waste management. That's also closely linked to the needs of this region. Now, digital sectors such as financial inclusion or cybersecurity, well, they will also recover their role, their importance also for international institutions. We work with some international institutions in these areas. There are inequality is terrible there too. It has become even worse during the pandemic. And working on the social sector, working on inclusive could also generate opportunities in the future. Now, competitors, of course, China. When we talk about competitors of China in Latin America, of course, China pops up. That's unavoidable. That's logical, of course. China has the power it has, and the companies that have never left China have started to leave China now, and in the sector of infrastructure to go abroad once they have acquired a lot of experience in their domestic market. Over the last 20 years, China has developed their infrastructure hugely, so they have acquired a lot of knowledge and know-how, and that has improved their presence abroad. Now, in Latin America, you have talked about a fundamental project regarding infrastructure. European companies and Chinese companies have been able to go there. Yes, but many administrations have decided to stop their decision-making processes, right? Well, yes, they have become much more careful. Now, the metro, the underground of Bogota, has also shown that Chinese companies are important there. Now, I think that part of the multilateral banking sector has made surprising decisions. Now, often funding is done in a co-funding manner. Chinese funding is not cheap at all. Sometimes we do think it is cheap, but it's not. But China finances or funds without any counter-actions, without any conditions, without any criteria. That is something that we do not do in Europe. We have seen these kinds of sanctions in Venezuela, in Ecuador, etc. So China just goes there because there are no other alternative. There's no alternative money there, but there have been also failures there because China is not used to that context, to that environment. Chinese companies are good at working in China, but not abroad necessarily. For instance, the high-speed train in Mexico, that was a failure too, that was very much talked about, and there China showed to be very fragile, to have really important gaps in some fields related to the regional and the cultural environment. Now, the underground of Bogota, we have seen that the Inter-American Development Bank has changed its guidelines and its principles. They are not going to boost the access of Chinese companies as much as until now. Now, in this environment, competitors will be Chinese companies, but not only Chinese companies. As funding goes to labor-intensive projects, there will be more. The competitors will rather be local companies, and then we will have to observe what the United States are going to do after fleeing from that region under the previous administration, and in their will to stop China. So that could also be an important element to be taken into account. So the evolution of commodities and political factors, well, you have talked about Peru with their elections. Brazil also will have elections, and recently Ecuador and Bolivia. and instability situations in Chile, Colombia, etc. So the environment is not easy at all. It's very challenging. Thank you so much for this analysis. Well, let's conclude this first round with conclusions that are important for our relations, the relations between the EU and Latin America, and therefore for Spanish companies and the Latin America region. Well, there are some agreements that are about to be signed, and these are the EU agreements with this region. And these agreements are evolving at different speeds, and these agreements tend to reduce bilateral hurdles for trade and investments. I would like to ask Juan Francisco Martinez to talk about the situation, about the current situation of these. How are these agreements evolving? What about Mercosur? Because apparently they are not managing to draw up a final new agreement. So what does the situation look like? Well, Maripaz, I would like to devote now some time to these agreements you just talked about. I'm going to talk about the framework, the legal framework, which is maybe not as an attractive a subject as some others. So in order to define this framework, first we have to understand that our benchmark, our reference framework is the international, the World Trade Organization, and work trade is conducted. Now, currently the situation is quite uncertain, as we all know, because of all the tensions within this organization due to the conflict between the US and China, for the reason we all are very familiar with, mainly due to geopolitical reasons. But we have to add to this bilateral trade agreements that evolve and always go further than the commitments within the WTO. Now, in Latin America, the region, except for the Mercosur agreement, the Mercosur agreement has actually been, that agreement has been signed with the EU. So we have, besides that, we have agreements with Mexico and with Central America, also with the Caribbean area, with Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. We have an agreement with Chile too. And as I said, we have also signed an agreement with Mercosur region, and I hope that we will be able to ratify this in short. We understand that some of these agreements are old agreements and they are being updated. We now have a new agreement with Mexico. It has to be signed yet, but I hope it will be signed soon. And we are negotiating with Chile so that we can conclude a new agreement with them too. And this is going on now. The two agreements that are outstanding that we have to be signed and ratified. Well, I would like to highlight that the agreement with Mexico was close to years ago in the political aspect, but still a date has to be found for the signature of this agreement. The EU and the Commission, the European Commission, would like to sign this agreement as soon as possible. It would be desirable for that to be signed over the next months, as soon as possible, before the summer if possible, and if not, well, anyway, as soon as possible so that it can be ratified afterwards. Now, Mercosur is especially important because of the importance, the significance of the economies of the countries that belong to this association. It is also important because of the agreement itself. It is the first free trade agreement with this region, between this region and another important economic region such as the EU. So the idea, the expectations are that we will finish our negotiations regarding some interpretation matters and some legal matters, and that after that, after solving that, we could also add some new commitments, some mutual commitments with regard to something that is as important as sustainability, environmental sustainability. Nevertheless, I must say that the agreement of Mercosur or with Mercosur includes a chapter on this matter precisely. It is maybe the most ambitious clause that has ever been negotiated in bilateral relations with this region by the EU. So this really marks the trend of our times. This has been included in this agreement, and most probably it will be included in future debates and future agreements too. And most probably this will be launched in the ministerial conference that will be held in September. In general, I can say that the agreements and the opportunities that this new agreement brings about will be significant opportunities. We hope that this agreement will really be beneficial for both continents or for both parties at both sides of the Atlantic. We will have better economic growth based on larger exports, and we will also be able to contribute to the recovery of this region, which is so important for them and for us too. We really need to step out of this current economic situation, which is so closely linked to the pandemic.
Thank you very much. That was a very concise contribution and a very clear one. I'll ask you about periods of time as well, deadlines. So we've seen what the situation of the continent was before and during the pandemic, and now I'll ask our four panelists to be creative, to imagine what the future might look like. And I'll ask Ricardo, what do you think are going to be the threats in a future free of a pandemic that could affect Spanish investments in this region, both positively and negatively? Yes, I want to be optimistic. I think we've got reasons to be optimistic. There's going to be a recovery and dynamism in Latin America. And many of the reasons why I previously justified why the crisis had a particular incidence in Latin America are the same reasons for a recovery from this crisis. This year, China is going to grow up to 10%, by 10% maximum, and even more in the next years. The figure will be 6% in the case of the United States. Raw material prices are increasing as well, to such an extent that some people are worried about the future developments regarding those prices, the threat of inflation. Remittances are an issue as well, but they will help as well in the future. So there are many factors, and the recovery itself from the pandemic, thanks to the vaccines, all those elements are going to help us think that there's going to be a recovery period in Latin America. But I also need to emphasize that this recovery is not going to be as dynamic as it should be. Most probably, growth will be lower than the one experienced by other emerging regions of the world and the world average, most probably. This year, we are expecting 4% growth for Latin America, a little bit more than that, but in future years it will be 3% or 2% further ahead. And I think there are certain reasons that explain that situation, and there's also an element that makes us fearful and worries us, that frightens us. So I'll start talking about the worst situation or the worst factor. There's a very clear thing, and not just in the case of Latin America, but in the whole world, related to this pandemic. Namely, poverty and inequality have soared. They're rampant, and this is particularly the case in Latin America. Despite the efforts and the concerns of the Mexican president, he had one of he was focusing on those problems. There are a couple of million of poor people under the poverty threshold in Mexico, and on top of that, there are very high figures, very high rates of corruption. 55 million Latin Americans have suffered being asked some bribery in order to have some bureaucracy thing done. Women have also been sexually harassed in exchange for facilities for certain bureaucratic procedures. A high percentage of the Latin American population think that politicians in Latin America pursue private interests rather than the common good. And on top of that, people are not satisfied with their democracies in Latin America, where we see figures of 70% of Latin Americans considering themselves dissatisfied with the democratic process in their countries. Inequality is very severe. The Gini indexes are much worse in Latin America than in other parts of the world. 40% of the Mexican population barely has 13% of the GDP, whereas 10% of the Mexican population has the rest, has 40% of the GDP. And that's a reason to have social unrest and conflict. We see the case of Colombia, especially in Cali, but same applies to Peru quite recently, and in Chile, where we least expected social unrest. Same happened in Colombia and everywhere in Latin America. I think that now Latin America is heading for conflict, and most of the countries are also facing excessive debt and budget crisis and public finance crisis. So trying to solve the second problem while having that difficult social situation is a very difficult task. No doubt, it's a challenge. Lots of help will be needed, lots of support, not just more integration and cooperation among Latin American countries, but also on the part of international financial institutions and the rest of the world. It is necessary to strengthen integration processes and the role of financial institutions, as Javier was saying, because a big part of those budget corrections can come from an unexpected growth, together with other positive factors, but Latin American countries definitely need reforms of their taxation systems on the side of income. In Mexico, tax income, barely amounts to 16% of the GDP, so it's very hard to build a market with social welfare with 16% income of GDP. And raising those incomes, raising that income out of this situation is quite hard. There are rigidities in social budget lines, and also how to start infrastructure projects will depend a lot on regional funding. So international financial institutions need to be aware of that situation of inequality that Latin American governments are facing. That's crucial. We need tax reforms, new structures, going for equality, promoting expenditure, and being efficient with income. That would be the best solution in order to attain both goals. When there's less margin for action in tax terms, explains why the situation is recovering less than we would expect, or the scenario is less positive than we expected. Some countries have done things well. In Chile and Peru, for example, there were tax packages, counter-cyclical tax packages, and they had some margin for action on the part of their governments. Countries which could have acted counter-cyclically a lot better would be Mexico, for example. An expansive tax policy, Keynesian policy, was expected from those countries, but the opposite happened. As it has been explained, the government in Mexico thought about past experiences which were finally negative for equality, because the most privileged classes, social classes, drew most of the advantages. But expenditure growth for social matters only grew 0.1%, which is unimaginable for such a country. And there's a new paradox, namely Brazil, 81% indebtedness was the figure that Brazil had at the beginning of the pandemic, and Brazil is acting against all expectations, contrary to Manuel López Obrador's government. Namely, Brazil is implementing a massively social policy. Minimum income has been established around $400 for each citizen. So at the end of the year 2020, public debt reached 98% and public deficit 10%. On top of that, Brazil has other difficulties to face. So Brazil has seen its rating being lowered the same could happen to other countries of the region, and these sort of developments can burden the recovery that we are all sure about, but yeah, that will be a burden for recovery. So, monetary policy margin is not the same as the one the main powers had. Lessons were learned from the previous financial crisis in the European Central Bank and similar institutions. We haven't faced financial instability. Latin America was also benefiting from that. It's true that all those economies have lost some weight, but it hasn't been a disaster in financial terms in the international scenario. That's why certain countries could have expansive policies encouraging investment. That's true, but the margin for action is not as big as in other powers, because there is a balance to be struck between action on the part of government, budget matters as well, and low interest rates that are not very attractive for foreign investments and for investment in general. So that situation encourages domestic savings. Vaccination is slower as well in Latin America. That little margin for tax policy and monetary policy issues are burdening that future recovery. On top of that, there is social unrest, debt is too high in the region, and that's why Latin America will recover, but not as much as in other regions of the world. I think that all economies need to go for a strengthening of financial institutions, together with integration mechanisms, as Juan Francisco mentioned. Thank you very much. So, Juan, which specific opportunities could there be for Spanish companies thanks to agreements on modernizing or implementing companies? What are the deadlines? Will the European Union or Spain have a whole set of operational agreements based on openness, on encouraging investment quite quickly, or? Well, I'll be a little bit pessimistic, as it is my tradition, let's say. So, we've seen that we can be optimistic because these trade agreements, for example, with Mexico, 90% of tariff could be cancelled, and other agreements with the European Union will no doubt have positive impact. But there will be different stages. First, we will need to approve, sign the agreements. So even if these two processes take place quickly, we will still need 1 or 2 years to see the first effects, which will be progressive, because the liberalization processes will need up to 10 years. It will be a progressive procedure. So in the short term, this is not as an encouraging measure for recovery in Latin America. There are many global problems and many situations of instability and uncertainty that will burden not just the region of Latin America, but rather all the economies of the region. As Ricardo was very well explaining, the impact of public action as a result of the necessary measures against the COVID pandemic has had fundamental impact on debt, which has grown very considerably in all countries of the world, in those that could afford to have more debt and in those who couldn't. And on top of that, these countries depend a lot on international financial institutions. If they want to continue providing the same services, these companies will need to expand their capital and their capacity to provide assistance. It will also be very interesting to remember that in Spain we've gone from 100% to 120% debt. And that would be important to know. And if there is no legal tool already established, such as an unemployment insurance or some figure such as the one of ERTE in Spain, a temporary unemployment period with salary, that will affect inequality in income, and that would be a very dangerous thing for social unrest in future years. So those factors make me pessimistic. And on top of that, there are global problems that do not contribute to facilitate this recovery, because sustainability, which we all acknowledge and try to incorporate into our recovery schemes, the European recovery scheme associated to technology and digitalization of sectors, sustainability has very important implications, both regionally and globally. And those implications are already being noticed in the World Trade Organization. For example, in November, there will be a work plan to see how we can incorporate the needs for further regulations of environmental issues. And the media have been referring to deforestation, the loss of the Amazonian region, forest fires, etc. And that is burdening the agreements from coming into force. I know my friends and colleagues and the Latin American audience will be delighted to know that these problems are not exclusive of Latin America. Tropical regions in Africa and in Asia are facing similar problems, even though we are focusing more on Latin America. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry about this problem, but rather that it's a global problem and we should tackle it from a global perspective. And at least we should be coherent when following up developments and when acting. It would be good that we could sort out this situation with the Mercosur countries, and we are working on that by reaffirming the commitment of both sides in fighting against climate change, strengthening their plans, and that's a possibility that we have there. That will contribute to our approving the Mercosur agreement earlier than expected. That will facilitate a recovery. We'll need to keep on working on those problems globally, which will affect us in the future. And I remind you as well that there is another problem on which we are working at the OECD, namely taxation for digital services. That's a global issue that is also affecting us. There will be many critical factors in that respect when analyzing economies, and we need to talk about that. The political debate needs to deal with those issues. Those issues should be taken on board on the agenda, and taxes will have to be raised for that. We can talk about economic recovery with more incentives, but if we do not tackle these problems, we'll be facing a scenario of further crisis. But in order not to be so pessimistic, I would say that we are still optimistic about the approval and quick signature of the agreement with Mexico. And if that signature takes place in the next 2 months, I think that by the end of this year we could have that agreement in force. The commercial agreement with Mexico would be good news, and we can also be quite optimistic to know that dialogue on environmental issues and fight against climate problems are making progress also with Mercosur, and let's hope that for the end of this year, by the end of this year, we also have agreements along those lines. But we'll have to see what the future has in store for us in Latin America, in Europe, and that could be an element that can foster the adoption of the agreement or not.
I would like to thank you all, ISEX and CESCE. I would like to ask you also to share with us, to talk about the products and services and actions in the field of giving support to the solvency of companies in Latin America you have. So what actions, what tools do you have, like investment, to support investment? Are you designing new products in this battery of instruments or tools? Do you have any that are specifically targeted to Latin America? Would you like to start? From the export credit insurance company? Well, first of all, I would like to say that I am happy because when one sells insurances and you have such an environment, such a context, well, it's easier to sell insurances, isn't it? I'm optimistic too. We have 5 subsidiaries, and the bulk of our subsidiaries really are there in Latin America, and we are present in the 5 main countries, and we trust these countries, and we want to continue to be there. Now, products and services. Well, CESCE is 50 years old already and has been giving support to companies that go international, to Spanish companies that go international. So we have been, of course, offering all kinds of products for these companies to become international, and we have been offering them through different channels. For instance, we have designed a range of products that cover all possible risks that could arise there when conducting businesses, or also insurances to direct exporters. for instance, an export credit insurance that will cover non-payments and contract defaults, etc. And products related to guarantees, etc., and products related to investments, so that when a direct investor helps to start up a company or needs to raise capital, for instance. So we have products also for construction projects or for engineering projects. And we have products also for distributing risks. Products also related to machines that are exported there. And then we also have insurances for financial entities. So it is about giving loans so that projects can be funded. And so there are products also that really ensure companies that go out there to sell goods, Spanish goods. And then we also have insurances for investment projects, and all of this is, so to speak, I think that all of this makes up a whole range of services that covers all possible risks, and we think that Spanish companies are really competitive thanks to these insurances. Now, we have also been giving support to Spanish exports companies. We have services and products that cover non-payment risks, conducting exports and conducting internationalization processes is quite challenging and complicated. So if in the end you are not paid for all your efforts, that's really frustrating. So our products are so comprehensive that we can cover all the phases of exports, looking for clients, managing risks regarding these clients, managing non-payments, managing receivables. These products also cover different payment options, and then we also give to different sized companies instruments that they can always have funds available. And then we have these 5 companies in the 5 main markets. In Latin America, there we have credit insurance products, and we also issue guarantees. I think that this is very important because Spanish companies in Latin America usually ask for a guarantee for signing any company. If you have not been there for a long time as a company, if you are not known by the bodies of that country, then it's difficult for you to get a guarantee there. The countries where we are present in Latin America and where we can issue these guarantees, for instance, Mexico, Colombia, Chile and Peru, well, what we offer Spanish companies is what we offer them is that we have a lot of experience there, and our experience there is what enables us to issue these guarantees. Of course, the knowledge you have of that region, the knowledge you have of the solvency profiles of the clients there is very important too. That has a lot of value too, doesn't it? It's not only the profile of clients, so it's not only the profile of those they conduct business with, but also, all the contracts they have to sign there with lots of clauses, and maybe interpreting those agreements or those contracts can be very challenging for Spanish companies. They do not know whether these are standard clauses or standard agreements or not, so our company can give that kind of legal advice too. That is really added value too. So I think that we really have the tools, we have the mechanisms, we have to be optimistic. As Ricardo said, recovery is starting now, And there are many elements, of course, that could bias the situation, that could distort the evolution. And, well, of course, what governments are doing, are going to do, is key. But let's see how this evolves. Before the pandemic, there was uncertainty, there were difficulties. After the pandemic, there will still be uncertainty and question marks. So I hope that we will be there to help all companies that need our help when going international. Now, the insurance for investments, is that a popular company? Is a popular product used by Spanish companies? Well, it's not the most popular product, actually. The investment insurance is not the most popular product, but we maybe should think why. What's the reason behind that? It's not really. So the main risk is already covered. When doing investments, is covered by another insurance. So you are covered, and you are covered from the risks of the inherent difficulties when you set up a company, or when you raise capital in a foreign country, or when you have to transfer capital from one country to another. Thank you so much. Javier, please, you have the floor. So what do you offer from your body? Well, on the one hand, we have the training, the information tools. In uncertain environments, information is key. It is important for companies to have updated information from the very start. We have this broad network of entities, bodies and companies, so we gather a lot of information and we provide companies with that information regarding specific sectors and other information, for instance, product-related information. We get around 60,000 questions every year, and around 10% come from Latin America. Then we also design products and services to each company. These are tailor-made solutions. Colombia, for instance, is in the top 5 markets to where Spanish companies go, and therefore where we provide our services. Then Chile, Mexico and Peru come after, or belong to the same top 5 group. Now, until now, we would get people together, and that was the way that information was provided, and now that is not possible, of course. So we are all using digital means. So we create contacts between different actors, between different players, but now we are doing this in a digital way, and we always try to create contacts between Spanish companies and the main key players there in the regions. We are doing this online, of course, because of the pandemic. It's not possible to do it in a physical way. So we identify opportunities, we identify the liaisons that we consider have to be in contact with Spanish companies. We are doing this, for instance, in the infrastructure sector. We identify specific projects, and we identify who are their managers so that they can count on Spanish companies. We look at their processes, at their recruiting and selection processes. So this is the way we act. We identify opportunities and we identify the key players. We have been talking about fiscal margin too, and one of the opportunities that can be there is that, well, that narrow fiscal margin of Latin American governments could maybe mean that there will be more concession of licenses. In labor-intensive sectors, well, those are not the sectors where Spanish companies are the best, but regarding concession of licenses, yes, that is something that Spanish companies are good. But let's see, when you have to charge a price to users, well, that becomes a sensitive issue. As Ricardo said, but for instance, the most expensive water is the one that is sold by a tank truck. It is much more expensive than the price for water that is charged by a company that has a license to operate. So in that region, in that field, our companies also have lots of opportunities. We have a lot of experience in that field too. You have also talked about international relations. We have relations with the World Bank. We also have close relations with the International Monetary Fund, with the Latin American Bank too, and we have also a subscription channel for companies, so that when there is whatever a bid, for instance, that companies can participate. And still we work online, of course, but we also contribute with activities that where the managers of the multilateral bank can play a role. They talk about their procedures, about their strategies, etc. I hope that we will be able to be physically present there as soon as possible on site. And we have a multilateral action in Guatemala. It was programmed for this month. We have postponed that. And we would also like to bring actors here to Spain. We would like to bring journalists and buyers, purchasers, managers from the multilateral bank too. We would like to bring all these actors to Spain as soon as possible. We are also working in Ecuador, Colombia, and Mexico with regard to the base of the pyramid, as you said, so offering business opportunities to low-income actors, and so that this way we can improve the social fabric of these countries and boost their social and economic situation. And now promoting investments, well, we promote investments to Latin America, of course, to other parts of the world, of course, too. And here in this field, we have a series of services that are complementary to what other financial entities offer. We offer information, we offer information about opportunities, we offer reports on the costs of setting up a company there. We also offer manuals regarding suppliers for any company that wants to go to a specific region there. And now we are about to close a program that will contribute to share costs when setting up a company for the first time abroad. In the current international arena, with so many elements, with so many actors, with such a complicated legislation, well, being local, going local is increasingly important. It is more important now than ever, so we have to make sure that Spanish companies are there, as close as possible, and that they are also there on the countries, in the countries, on site. Thank you so much. I think that now we could start to draw conclusions, and maybe you could now contribute with your last improvised comments. Maybe we can then say that Latin America after the pandemic will offer opportunities and challenges too, and of course they face difficulties and challenges, both macroeconomic and structural, social and fiscal problems, of course. and that the opportunities that this continent offers to our companies depend on the evolution of their economies on the one hand, and on the other hand, on their skills and ability to solve the social inequality problems and the fiscal gaps they have there, which is related to their macroeconomic problems. They also have all kinds of external restrictions imposed on their raw material and on other instruments. I understand that the instruments that you both offer, CESTE and ISEX, are totally proportionate, and these are being updated all the time. They are digital, they are online, and they are designed to face up to the challenges and to help our companies overcome their fears so that they will decide to go abroad. We could also say that the free trade agreements that include investments and social responsibilities, well, these free trade agreements are being updated, they are undergoing transformation processes, and some of them are about to be signed. And we have also said that in the near future these will be, the ones that have not yet been signed will be signed, and this will provide for a more liberal, more free trade environment that will be beneficial for both parties, for both continents. And now I would like to refer to a matter that has been dealt with by our speakers, namely the business climate in Latin America. Our investments and our companies have been successful, and we want to ensure that for the future too. I think that what Javier said is very important. He said that there is some sort of removal of investments on behalf of big companies. They have conducted divestiture actions, but nevertheless there are, on the other hand, SMEs that are still present there and who are actually enlarging their investments. Now, the macroeconomic future of this region will involve funds for modernizing and upgrading infrastructures throughout the Latin American continent. For budgetary reasons, the trend will be to act in or to have private-public partnerships and concession models too. This is something that really should be looked at by the Secretary of State. So we should really look at how to help our companies to arrive there in or land in regulated environments, not unregulated environments. Peru is a good example of how each concession project have ended up in arbitration tribunals or in other courts, or are under very burdensome processes. These are very cumbersome for them and also for our companies. Sometimes Spanish companies end up leaving those countries, and in other cases you end up being stuck in very long legal processes. So we are looking at new models for protecting investments and for protecting companies. And these models are very much inspired on the debates, on the conversations that are being conducted in the EU and also in the OECD. Voy a dar dos rasgos así muy básicos que básicamente The idea is to provide room
o árbitros múltiples y públicos.
Middlemen or for arbitration institutions, so that we can put an end to this very complex arbitration environment, these very challenging and complex arbitration processes, which are also very expensive. So the idea is to create something to solve these terrible problems. And Spain has for a long time claimed that Spain should be allowed to participate in these arbitration processes. So if something suddenly happens in that country that really affects the situation of the company, well, that company should be compensated for that in some way. So we are working on this at this very moment, and we are looking at how to pave the way for new investments. And once again, I would like to say that it is very satisfying to hear that social responsibility is being taken on board in all companies that are present there, and this will stop from future breaches occurring, and this will impose minimum requirements with regard to environmental matters or gender matters. Would you like to add something?
I think we've got 5 minutes still, and if not, we'll just call it a day right here. Yes, in order to complete a little bit those ideas, I would also say that we are also working on green policies, namely for companies that protect the environment, that they are environmentally friendly, with clean energy and so on. They will have insurance policies that are even more advantageous. And the company, the group, is going for corporate responsibility, environmental protection, and that's in our plans for 2021 and 2024. Yes, I know that. I think companies must be aware that sustainability is a factor for competitiveness in foreign markets, all the more if there is funding involved. Well, thank you very much for all your contributions. It was very interesting to hear your comments. I'm sure that companies and clients will be delighted to have been here listening to you today. Thank you very much. We thank you all the panelists. As one guest yesterday was saying, we would like to be here in 50 years' time to see if these predictions come true, but at least I would like to have the opportunity next year in this hub of Madrid platform to count on you again. That would be great. Thank you very much. It's almost noon here in Madrid. We'll go and have lunch, but we'll be back for international taxation and Madrid as a destination for investment. Thank you. See you later.